work for, which we will go through very quickly. So we work across the engineering and construction industries. So you can see on the slide there, bottom right-hand corner, utilities. We work on infrastructure, we work transportation, and marine and offshore. So very, very close to the types of work that CECA members get involved in. Established in 1978, we are stock exchange listed, and we have a network of offices around the world. In terms of offices within the UK, you can see there, again, we're situated in different places all around the UK. Hooton, Cheshire is the office that I work out of, and Haslingden, Lancashire is our head office. Three main parts of the business. On the left-hand side, you can see driver project services. So we can provide basically project managers, QSs and planners onto live construction sites. I work for driver Trett in the middle, and essentially I like to call it a cradle to grave service in terms of commercial assistance. So in terms of upfront, we can review contracts for you, provide training on the projects that you're about to embark on, and answer obviously ad hoc questions. As a project proceeds, you might need some help in some of the correspondence, whether it's drafting the correspondence or responding to correspondence. And again, we can work with you, whether the letters go out on our name or on your letterhead. We're pretty relaxed. We can assist also on the final account side. That could be extension of time claims. It could be just straightforward compensation, event evaluation. And then, of course, we get involved in dispute resolution services as well. Finally, on the right-hand side, we have Dialis, which is our expert witness division. We have experts in quantum, delay, and also technical experts. Essentially, they would tend to work in litigation and arbitration. As well as that, we have adjudicators, arbitrators, and mediators working for the business as well. We also produce a digest magazine twice a year. The next one is out very, very shortly. This is the one from, I think, around February, March this year. And it's available free on our website, or there's fancy things you can do with your phone and smart codes and whatever else. A little bit about me. Very proud to say, of course, that I'm a quantity surveyor. So I've done a degree and I'm chartered. I used to work for a main contractor, which was Balfour Beatty, for 5 years as a site quantity surveyor. Moved into consultancy, did a law degree part-time over 4 years. I'm a solicitor's exams over a further 2 years. And I've worked in construction claims consultancy now for over 20 years. So on with the show, as they say. And I know I'm supposed to be talking today about compensation events, but I just couldn't resist putting a couple of slides in with regard to communications. And I've only got 2 slides on this. I am concentrating really on NEC4. NEC3 is similar, but there are a few tweaks on the wording to be aware of. So clause 13.1 in NEC4 reads, each communication which the contract requires is communicated in a form which can be read, copied, and recorded. Writing is in the language of the contract. So 13.1, it's a simpler version in NEC4 than we saw under NEC3. And essentially what I'm expecting is everything, all communications must be in writing. None of that verbal instruction, verbally communication stuff, because of course that's when things turn into a pantomime, with one party saying, oh yes, I did say this, and the other party saying, oh no, I didn't. So we are not going down that route at all with NEC. 13.2 is also significantly different. I do smile when I start to read out 13.2 because NEC is definitely a contract which is easier to read than JCT, than FIDIC contracts. However, 13.2 is a bit wordy. So here we go. It says, if the scope specifies the use of a communication system, a communication has effect when it is communicated through the communication system specified in the scope. Now, I am sure there must be a simpler way of addressing this. For example, surely the contract data should simply specify the scope, and 13.2 should just say the parties shall communicate as set out in the contract data part 1. That surely is something that we will see in an update. It continues, if the scope does not specify a communication system, a communication has effect when it is received at the last address notified by the recipient for receiving communications, or if none is notified at the address of the recipient stated in the contract data. So, starting point on this is we want to make sure that every communication that a CECA member issues out under an NEC contract, that it's a valid communication under the contract. So rule 1 here is dead easy. Check the scope. Does that specify a communication system? If so, that trumps everything else. If there's no communication system, have either of the parties written to each other to say how you're going to communicate? I'm going to have a little bit of a stab at a percentage here. My guess would be that 99% of the people on today's session have never seen a communication from one party to the other party confirming your address for receiving communications. I'm going to say I've never seen one despite asking for them on lots and lots of jobs. So nothing in the scope, no communications by either party confirming the address to be used. What we then do is the last place you'd look is the address in the contract data. Now, under NEC4, there's 2 addresses in the contract data. And again, I just think this could be tidied up a little bit. The address of the recipient in the contract data is normally the postal address. There is a separate box that says address for electronic communications, but 13.2 doesn't say at the electronic address of the recipient. Will that cause a problem or not? We don't know. It's no cases on this at all. So you must make sure that you are absolutely clear that you are abiding by 13.2. I was working on a job a couple of weeks ago, and the contractor said, yes, yeah, we're using a particular document management system. I can't remember whether it was CMAR or Workspace. And I said, great, whereabouts in the scope does it say that that's what you're going to use? And there was a deathly silence that came over the room at that point. So essentially, the parties had just fallen into using this particular communication system. And yet, actually, if you take a very narrow view of 13.2, it wasn't a valid way of communicating between the parties at all. And I am going to say that my guess is that that's very common, that people just start using it without reading 13.2 carefully. So definitely everyone on this session today, make sure you do read 13.2 clearly. The only other slide or only other clause I want to mention here in regard to communications, given I only have an hour, is 13.7. 13.7 reads, a notification or certificate which the contract requires is communicated separately from other communications. Now, essentially, what you must not do is issue one document or one communication and then put in there 3 CEs or 3 early warnings or 2 CEs and an early warning, or an issue of a program, an issue of a progress report, and a couple of CEs. You can't mix them up. You've got to communicate them separately. And again, given that this is a session on compensation events, it's so important to make sure that you comply with the whole of clause 13. And I've only picked out 3 of the clauses there. And yes, I'm going to say something else very briefly before we actually move on to compensation events. And that's the issue of early warnings. Now, we're going to have a bit of audience participation at this point. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of issues that have come up over the past couple of months. And I'm going to ask people to type into the chat very simply a yes or a Y, or alternatively an N or a no, or a thumbs up or a thumbs down, as to whether you have given an early warning notice about any of these issues. Okay, here we go. Fingers crossed for some good audience participation. The first one is, has anyone notified monkeypox as an issue? This just gives me an opportunity to have a slurp of my coffee. We have an absolute flood of no's at this point. There is not a single person who has notified that monkeypox might be an issue. So far, so good. Will it become an issue? Who knows? Okay, item 2. COVID cases on the increase. If any of you have watched any news programs over the past week, obviously COVID cases have just increased massively. Yay or nay on this one? And again, I'm not seeing anyone giving any notifications in relation to COVID cases increasing. I'm kind of going to describe you guys as gamblers, really. We'd be all right, is the feeling I'm getting from the room at this point. Okay, number 3. I appreciate that we are in the Northwest and we tend to use our cars quite a bit. Anyone notified an early warning with regard to strikes? Whether it's train drivers strikes or I'll say, I think it's communication workers. We have got, finally, I find that there is a yes too. Oh, actually, we've got a mix now on the strikes. I'm feeling warmer. One saying yes, but it was a railway project. Excellent. Again, I think that probably if we were among the more cautious people, all of those 3 issues we should be notifying. Number 4, one specifically from yesterday, fuel protests. So I don't know whether, and again, people saw the news, but there were a number of major motorways in the UK that were stopped because of fuel protests. I have a yes from Paul on that one, thank you. A couple more, Ashley, another yes on that, great stuff. Number 5, I'm going to say on this one, it's probably too late now. The effect of the Ukraine war. Oh, actually, we've got some people who are well into the notifications. A good few people in relation to Ukraine there were giving notices. The final one, material supply issues. Now, that whether that's price increases or lack of availability. I'm definitely getting a stream of yeses on this. In fact, I haven't got a no on this particular point, which is great. Excellent. If you haven't read this already, now I'm going to admit I have only read it this morning. The Construction Leadership Council on the 28th of June issued a statement with regard to price increases and material availability. Their summary was average inflation so far this year on materials, 23%. It's higher for energy intensive materials such as insulation, cement, concrete and steel. On those energy intensive materials, there are further significant increases expected in the second half. And importantly, the CLC did say something that I have suspected from talking to quite a lot of clients, that there is using their words, a failure of the indices to reflect reality. So all of that is definitely leading me to believe, and I'm glad lots and lots of people have issued early warnings in relation to those issues, that yes, you are well on top of doing that. It's interesting though, out of those 6 issues, if you read the construction press, I'd say that in item 6, the material price increases and material supply issues, that's all over the press. I don't know whether I've seen that many articles on monkeypox. So we have to think more widely than what's the general construction press saying. Okay, a quick reminder in relation to the early warning clause. 15.1, again, NEC 4 says the contractor and the project manager give an early warning by notifying the other as soon as either becomes aware of any matter which could increase the total of the prices, delay completion, delay meeting a key date, or impair the performance of the works in use. The PM or the contractor may give an early warning by notifying the other of any matter which could increase the contractor's total costs. The PM enters the early warning matters in the early warning register. And then finally, early warning of a matter for which a CE has previously been notified is not required. Now, I'm going to mention here what I call the 50% rule. If something is less likely than 50% likely to increase the prices, delay completion, delay a key date, or impair the performance of the works in use, less than 50%, go for the early warning notice first. If it's more than 50% likely to happen, I think you should give serious consideration into not bothering with the early warning and immediately instead giving a compensation event notification. Now, there is an exception on this, because if you actually are going to wait before you give the CE notification, then you're not obeying 15.1. In other words, you're not giving that early warning as soon as. So you only drop the early warning if you're going to give the compensation event notification now and straight away. Okay. Unless there's an amendment to the clause, you don't have to match EWs with the CE notifications. So definitely, every time an issue comes up and someone says to you, we need to give an early warning, think to yourself, is this more likely to happen than not? And should we just jump straight into the CE notification or not? So that's my 50% rule. And the reason for having the 50% rule is I just don't want anyone to miss giving the compensation event notification. What we're going to go through in this next section is a reminder of what a standard unamended NEC4 contract lists out as the compensation events. If I was working on a live construction site now, I would definitely say if there's a general site meeting that takes place once a week, or the commercial and the ops staff get together at a particular point to talk about any particular issues, tag on at the start or the end, almost like a brainstorm of, have any of these Cs happened? For those of you on the commercial or the ops side, I would definitely advise sticking the list of compensation events into your diary, your black and red book, and reviewing the list regularly, because you never want to miss giving one of these compensation event notifications because of the sanctions and the time bar. So a reminder, the following events are compensation events. Now, I have done a little bit of highlighting. You can see some of the numbers are highlighted, and we will look at the reasons for those being highlighted at the end of this section. So 60.11, probably the most common compensation event that you will come across. The project manager gives an instruction changing the scope, except a change made in order to accept a defect, or a change to the scope provided by the contractor for its design, which is made at the contractor's request, or in order to comply with the scope provided by the client. So project manager giving an instruction is number one. Number two is all about access. The client does not allow access to and use of each part of the site by the later of its access date and date for access shown on the accepted program. The key wording for me here is the access dates need to be on the accepted program. Okay, so make sure that you've actually got those specifically as milestone dates. If they're not on there, you might lose your right to be able to claim compensation event number 2. Number 3, the client does not provide something which it is to provide by the date shown on the accepted program. Again, we've got another reference to the accepted program. This could be to do with free issue materials. It could be to do with the clients having the responsibility of signing off this statutory undertaker's paperwork, or indeed it could be design acceptance. Again, I'm expecting specific client milestone dates for these items. If it's not on there, you are putting your entitlement at risk. Item 4 is another highlighted one. The project manager gives an instruction to stop or not to start any work or to change a key date. Item 5, the client or others do not work within the time shown on the accepted program, do not work within the conditions stated in the scope, or carry out work on the site that is not stated in the scope. Working on 2 contracts at the moment. One of them actually has 4, I'll call them main contractors on the job. There's a civils contractor, there's a building contractor, and then there's 2 specialist contractors, all separately employed by the client. That's one job. A second job, I'm working for, I'll call them the shell contractor. And again, there's 2 specialist contractors. All 3 on that job are employed by the client. Making sure that you have the dates of these others, so the other contractors working on the site would be part of the others, is so important, because if they then interfere with your work, their obligations need to be on the accepted program to allow you to be able to claim a compensation event. So that's that's 3 of the first 5 C's that are inextricably linked to the accepted program. Now, I know some of you on the session today are subcontractors, and whilst I feel that there is a relatively good compliance by main contractors in issuing accepted programs up the line to the clients, I think that subcontractors need to make sure that they are doing as well as main contractors up the line. So subcontractors, again, you need to think about this in a subcontract context. Okay, number 6, the project manager or the supervisor does not reply to a communication from the contractor within the period required by the contract. My coffee's going cold here, so I need to ask another question. Can you put in the chat the period for reply in your current NEC contract? Almost, apart from a slight difference between 14 days and 2 weeks, which of course 14 days with holidays or without holidays, 2 weeks obviously would be 2 calendar weeks. Everyone has gone for the same period of time. And I would say that that probably is industry standard between contractors and clients. I definitely see different periods of time between main contractors and subcontractors, and that needs careful looking at as well. Okay, item 7. Project manager gives an instruction for dealing with an object of value or of historical or other interest found within the site. Again, that's your typical fossils type clause or antiquities clause. Item 8. PM or the supervisor changes a decision which either has previously communicated to the contractor. I'm going to admit here, I've never seen number 8 used where there's a change in a decision. I'm sure somebody on this will have an example of it though. Item 9, PM withholds an acceptance other than acceptance of a quotation for acceleration or not correcting a defect for a reason not stated in the contract. Again, rare to see that one being used. 10 is what I call the old opening up clause. Supervisor instructs the contractor to search for a defect. No defect is found unless the search is needed only because the contractor gave insufficient notice of doing work, obstructing a required test or inspection. 11, test or inspection done by the supervisor causes unnecessary delay. 12, probably for civil engineering contractors and subcontractors, this would rate as number 2 in terms of popularity, which of course is the physical conditions clause. Contractor encounters physical conditions which are within the site, are not weather conditions. And I have to say, the bit that I think is the most difficult to get over, an experienced contractor would have judged at the contract date to have such a small chance of occurring that it would have been unreasonable to have allowed for them. Now, if I wanted to simplify the contract, I think I would probably get rid of bullet point 3 and say something along the lines of, the contractor has allowed for this type of ground condition, and if it is any different from this or this type of physical condition, if it's any different, then it is a compensation event. The wording of that bullet point 3 is just a little bit on the foggy side for me. And I think that there's too much unnecessary debate, and I think the wording could be tidied up there. I don't think I've got much of a chance of getting that through as an amendment on the next version of NEC though. Okay, 13. I know that some of you in the past have been enthused or bored by the fact that I can do a whole hour on weather. So effectively, 13 would allow you to claim time and money in relation to a weather event. Take care. The wording is difficult in relation to, if you go towards the bottom of 13, on average, less frequently than once in 10 years. This means that it's unlikely that you would be able to claim a weather issue. And also, you can see that there's reference here to the contract data. Contract data part 1 specifies certain weather measurements that need to be taken, but does not mention wind. So if you want to be able to claim windy weather as a compensation event, you will need to amend contract data part 1. Okay, 14, an event which is a client's liability stated in these conditions of contract. 15, PM certifies takeover of a part of the works before both completion and the completion date. 16, the client does not provide materials, facilities and samples for tests and inspection as stated in the scope. 17, correction to an assumption. We will talk about that again. 18 is a breach of contract. And 19, something that we've touched on already. Generally, people do refer to it as the force majeure clause. Probably the better phraseology under NEC is the prevention clause. So an event happens which neither party could prevent. It's the final bullet point, which is identical to the wording that we saw under the physical conditions. An experienced contractor would have judged at the contract date to have such a small chance of occurring that it would have been unreasonable to have allowed for it, and is not one of the other compensation events stated in this contract. Again, think widely about number 19. We covered some of the issues that I think could come under number 19, monkeypox, Ukraine, those kind of issues. There are another 2 under NEC 4. Number 20, the PM notifies the contractor that a quotation for a proposed instruction is not accepted. And then finally, additional compensation events stated in contract data part 1. So that list is the unamended list. And of course, the bad news is that you might find that some of these are amended through the Z clauses on your contracts. And that needs very careful consideration. A couple of weeks ago, I was working on a significant project worth tens of millions of pounds. And to my horror, when I started looking through the terms, clause 60.112 on physical conditions had been deleted. Contractor was less worried about it than I was. It is a greenfield site, and they've carried out most of the groundworks already. And then they used the phrase of death under a letter of intent. So I did think to myself, I'm going to get some work out of this project. But anyway, we shall see. There's more clauses in there about physical conditions, in particular 60.2. So in other words, when you're looking at physical conditions, you are assumed to have taken into account the site information, publicly available information in the site information obtainable from a visual inspection of the site. And again, we're back to what could an experienced contractor could reasonably be expected to have or to obtain. If I was doing a compensation event for physical conditions, I would actually have a short paragraph about each of those 4 items to show that actually these physical conditions that you've encountered could not have been foreseen and you should not have allowed for them. 60.3 is also important in relation to ambiguities. And again, we will touch on that as we go through the slides. Okay, in terms of notification, any of you that have spent any time looking at compensation events and NEC contracts, I am sure have read clause 61.3. Is it the most important clause in the contract? Oh, probably I'm being entirely selfish. And for me, yes, it is. So 61.3 says the contractor notifies the PM of an event which has happened or which is expected to happen as a CE. There's my 50% rule. If it's over 50%, you are expecting it to happen. If you believe it's a compensation event and the PM has not notified it. If the contractor does not notify the compensation event within 8 weeks of becoming aware that the event has happened, prices, completion date and a key date are not changed unless the event arises from the PM or the supervisor giving an instruction or notification, issuing a certificate, or changing an earlier decision. Now, my hint from before, do you remember some of those Cs were highlighted? They were highlighted because they're the ones that it is the project manager or the supervisor's duty to notify, and therefore it's not your duty to notify. The time bar doesn't kick in. Be aware of changes to the yellow text. The 8 weeks on the contract I'm working on at the moment has been changed to 2 weeks. The wording, unless the event arises, I am seeing more and more clients and main contractors within subcontracts deleting that yellow wording. The other bit I've highlighted in here is a bit in green. Effectively, it's important to work out what day 1 of the 8-week period is. And it kicks off from of becoming aware that the event has happened. Okay, again, that could be altered as well. What I would love is that everyone on the session today realizes that an easy way for a client or a PM to kick back on a compensation event notification is to say, Sorry, mate, you didn't notify us in time. And we don't want that to happen at all. So making sure that you give the compensation event notification within the 8 weeks, so there's no argument on timescales, should be high up on the list. My list of things in relation to notification: number 1, if in doubt, write it out. Number 2, check the method of service. Are you serving the notice in the correct way? Document management systems, communication systems, are they referred to in the scope? Number 4, within the contractor or the subcontractor's site team, are you giving one person the responsibility to do the notifications, or can anyone notify? You need to ensure that you've got a clear method for making sure that everybody knows what the system is and that you give these notices on time. The detail. My best way of describing the detail is quite simple. If you were to send your notification to me, bearing in mind I don't know anything about the jobs that you guys are working on, I should be able to understand it. I don't want any acronyms. I don't want any project speak, because people do use their own language on a particular project. That CE notification needs to stand on its own 2 legs. So if you need to attach documents, then you should. The final thing I'm going to mention in compensation event notification is the reply. Project manager has a week to reply unless you agree to a longer period. At the bottom of this clause, there is what I'm going to call a deeming procedure. Okay. So in other words, if you don't actually get a response from the project manager, you can then say, you've not replied to me. If they don't respond in the time period set out, the compensation event is deemed to be accepted. We are going to touch on that in the next few minutes. The assessment. Within the notes, I have got plenty of slides in here about assessing compensation events. The main clause to look at is 63.1, and essentially changes to the prices are assessed as the effect of the compensation event upon defined cost plus fee. Now there's a tweak here. It's the actual defined cost of the work done by the dividing date and the forecast defined cost of the work not done by the dividing date. This is the crystal ball element of compensation events. So essentially, you need to make sure that when you're pricing or assessing compensation events, you split them in 2. What are you valuing on an actual defined cost basis, and what are you doing on a forecast defined cost basis? Sometimes everything will fall into the forecast, sometimes everything will fall into the actual. Make that clear on your assessment. Defined cost then takes us to 52.1. Essentially, we're looking at rates and percentages in the contract data, or open market and competitively tendered prices. If you're on option A, we're going to move to the short schedule of cost components. Because of time, I'm sticking just with option A for today's session. And you can see that I've just set out there the different elements or the different components of the short schedule of cost components. We are going to do a little bit on the people costs. But I will say, do not forget to add the fee on. So the people costs side. If we're on NEC 4, you will need to grab the people rates from contract data part 2, and you'll need to be clear on how the working areas work. The starting point for working areas is contract data part 2. Now, if you look at the short schedule of cost components, you will see that there's some rules in part 1 in relation to the people that you can claim when assessing compensation events. The first 2 bullet points are directly employed people, and the third bullet point is for people who aren't directly employed. The bit I want to concentrate on, though, is item 11. Amounts calculated by multiplying each of the people rates by the total time appropriate to that rate spent within the working areas. Now, again, a little bit of tidying up that I think is needed under NEC 4 to have two different definitions that you pronounce the same is not good drafting. So we have italicized working areas described in contract data part 2. And if we just describe that as large, and then we've got working areas with capitals, which I'm going to describe as smaller. So the working areas, small, are those parts of the working areas, large, which are necessary for providing the works and used only for work in this contract. I have an issue with this, particularly because, of course, people are working from home, people are working from the office rather than working from site. If you take a very strict reading of definition 18 and part 1 of the short schedule of cost components, you can only claim for people whilst they are working in the capitalized working area. So not when you're at home, not when you're in your offices. And that needs very careful thought. You need to amend 18, or do you need to increase your people rates or increase your fee to include for the fact that if they're not in the right place, you aren't able then to include them in your assessment. Assumptions is another one of my bugbears. Unfortunately, it is only the project manager who can allow you to include assumptions in your compensation event. If you as the contractor or subcontractor include an assumption in your compensation event assessment, you are taking the risk as to whether that amount of money, that amount of time, those figures are correct or not. So if you make a wrong assumption, unfortunately, there is no magic pill for sorting that out. When you do your quotation, remember that the quote must cover time, and I'm going to say 3 elements: completion, key dates, and perhaps sectional dates if you've got them. And then on the money side, the direct costs. And I've also said there the indirect costs. Now, of course, by that, I'm referring to any prolongation costs. And of course, you must include a programme if there are time implications as well. You have 3 weeks to do your quote. Project manager has 2 weeks to reply. And then again, we have this deeming procedure, which we'll run through at the end. When you are assessing the compensation events, there is a sanction if you hadn't given an early warning. So take care with 63.7. 63.8 confirms that you should include for any items or any matters which have a significant chance of occurring. And I think it is a good idea to include a section in the quotation called risk allowance. This could be where you are pricing something now and the work is going to be done in October, November. So, for example, you need to include something in there for weather-related issues. 63.9 just gives the project manager another reason to perhaps look a little bit more closely at your assessment. If the project manager believes that the contractor has failed to act competently and promptly to the compensation event, or that the additional time or cost are not reasonably incurred, that will be taken account when the project manager then reviews your assessment. 63.10 relates to ambiguities in the scope provided by the client, and that's a very useful clause, particularly if there is an ambiguity and the client project manager has then chosen a particular element of the scope over another. This might cost you more money, and you then can claim extra time and money because of this. Take care. 63.10 is often amended. Within the notes, I've also included what I've described as the default mechanism. Now, the default mechanism or the deeming mechanism, or I sometimes refer to it as the red flag mechanism, occurs within clause 60. We've got 61.4. We've also got 62.6 and 64.4. The other deeming procedure is in relation to the acceptance of the programme. I would say that if I'm doing a contract review on an NEC contract, this is almost like taking the temperature of how, could I say evil, how nasty, how contractual the client, the project manager has been. If these deeming procedures or default mechanisms are deleted, then essentially, I do wonder whether the parties then are acting in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, because essentially the contract doesn't work if the two parties aren't replying to each other quickly, client to contractor, or indeed the contractor to the subcontractor. So I would want you to fight to include all of these. And actually, it's good project management to make sure the parties are replying to each other on time. So check out the default mechanisms, check if they're in your contract, and if they are, you should operate them properly. If the project manager doesn't reply within the timescales set out, the contractor must remind the project manager, and if they fail to reply to the reminder, effectively, in relation to 61.4, the compensation event in principle is accepted. In relation to 62.6 and 64.4, the quotation is accepted in relation to time and money. The main other thing I want to cover before we look at an overall summary is the issue of dealing with multiple changes or multiple compensation events. And I think this is a big problem. So here's the scenario. You're working on a project which is suffering many issues, such as late information from the client, as well as client changes and issues with access. You've been presented with a number of new drawings which contain several changes. Your assessment of everything that's going on at the moment is the following. Compensation event 43 on its own will delay the project by a week, and compensation events 44 and 45, again on their own, will delay the project by 1 week each. However, all three compensation events together will delay the project by 2 weeks. And my question is, how on earth do you then assess the prelims, the prolongation costs, the overrun costs when you are pricing the above? So option one is effectively that you price each one on its own merits, regardless of the others. Or option two is you stick the tail on the donkey. In other words, you choose which one you think is the best and you lump all of your prelim or prolongation costs into the best one and you don't put it into the other two. So are we going to go for option A? You price 2 weeks and 1 week and 1 week in each individual CE. Or option B is you choose your best. Can I have some votes in the chat from the audience? A, each one stands on its own merits, or option B, stick the tail on the donkey and choose your best one. I am very, very, very pleased to announce that we have a full complement of option A's. I think the other thing I would do is definitely inform the project manager of what you've done in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, and essentially say, if you want to actually look at C's 43, 44 and 45, note that we've priced the prelims and the prelims do overlap between these three issues. Okay, my summary in relation to this issue. And I appreciate this has been a very, very fast run through this issue. Early warnings, be aware there is a sanction in 63.7. really, I think the early warning procedure is good. I think it's good that it's NEC. I'm seeing more and more other contracts copying it. And essentially, it's about people working cooperatively and making sensible decisions in relation to what's happening. If you're not giving the early warning notices, there is the sanction, but also it means that you're not properly managing the project. Item 2, the condition precedent clause 61.3. The notification is vital. Remember the 8-week period, but remember the 8 weeks might be changed. When you come to the assessment, think in relation to time that you're looking at key dates, sectional dates, and also completion dates as well. And on the money, the concentration is on the short schedule of cost components plus the fee, but also remember direct and indirect. Remember also the deeming procedures as well, and make sure you operate them. If they're deleted in your contract, my view would be that you've probably got a very exciting set of amendments to your contract, an exciting set of Z clauses. Records. I could just do just hours on saying that word to you, but that is so important when it comes to making sure that you are going to be properly recompensed in relation to your projects. Of course, a key part of record keeping would be early warnings and, of course, compensation.